I thought Julian and I had the kind of love story people wrote movies about. We met when he was 18 and I was 17. And it was like something just clicked into place the moment we locked eyes across that crowded party. Within months, I'd moved into his place because honestly, why waste time with the whole dating dance when we both knew this was it? He was this ambitious, driven guy with big plans, and I could see he was going to be successful. The way he looked at me in those early days, like I was the most incredible thing that had ever happened to him, made me feel like I was exactly where I belonged. By the time he turned 21, he'd already proposed, and I knew I'd made all the right choices. Here was this guy who was clearly going places, who worshipped the ground I walked on, and who wanted to build a life with me. We waited until we were 26 to actually get married because Julian wanted to be financially stable first, which I thought was so mature and responsible of him. The wedding was everything I dreamed of. And I remember thinking how lucky I was to have found someone who understood that I deserved to be treated like a princess. The best part was how Julian handled everything. He made enough money that I didn't have to stress about work or bills or any of that mundane stuff. When he suggested we spend 2.5 years living in Australia and New Zealand, I was thrilled. What kind of life would I have had with someone else? Probably stuck in some tiny apartment worrying about rent and working some dead-end job. Instead, I got to experience the world, all expenses paid, with a man who clearly adored me. Those years abroad were like an extended honeymoon, and I loved how other couples would look at us with obvious envy. We were the couple everyone wanted to be. When we came back and I got pregnant with Leo, I felt like my life was perfectly falling into place. Julian was so excited about becoming a father, and he made sure I had everything I needed during the pregnancy. He'd already been promoted twice at his company, and his salary kept climbing. I didn't have to lift a finger around the house if I didn't want to, and he never once complained about being the sole provider. That's just the kind of man he was, always putting his family first. The first 2 years with Leo were honestly magical. Julian would come home from these long, stressful days at work and immediately take over with the baby so I could relax. He'd handle the nighttime feedings on weekends. He'd play with Leo for hours, and he made sure I never felt overwhelmed by motherhood. I remember thinking how different my experience was from other new moms who constantly complained about their lazy husbands. Julian was nothing like that. He was present, involved, and completely devoted to both of us. But there was one thing that started to bother me more and more as time went on. Every single evening without fail, Julian would disappear onto our balcony with his cigarettes for an hour or two. He'd been smoking since he was 21, and I'd never really minded it before. But something about the routine started to feel selfish. Here I was stuck in the house all day with a toddler, and the moment he got home, he'd spend time with us for a bit and then vanish for his precious alone time. I tried to tell myself it was his way of decompressing from work, but it began to feel like he was choosing cigarettes over quality time with his family. When Leo turned 2 and the lockdown started, I was going stir-crazy. I'd been out of the workforce for over 2 years. And while I'd loved being a stay-at-home mom, I was starting to feel like I was losing myself. That's when Donovan, this director at a marketing firm, reached out about a personal assistant position. The timing felt like fate. And when he explained that I'd be the only woman in an all-male office, something about that appealed to me. I'd forgotten what it felt like to be around men who weren't related to me or married to my friends. Julian was supportive when I told him about the job opportunity, which was typical of him. He always wanted me to be happy. And if I wanted to go back to work, he was behind me 100%. I think part of me had hoped he might seem a little more concerned about the change, maybe ask more questions about what this would mean for our routine, but he just smiled and said whatever I wanted to do was fine with him. Looking back, I wonder if he was actually relieved to have me out of the house and busy with something that wasn't his responsibility. The first day at the new job was like stepping into a completely different world. Donovan introduced me around the office, and I could feel every single man's attention on me in a way I hadn't experienced in years. They were all so polite, so interested in getting to know me, asking about my background and my thoughts on various projects. During lunch, 3 different guys offered to show me around the area, and when I mentioned I had a 2-year-old at home, they all seemed impressed by how well I was balancing everything. What struck me most was how valued I felt. These weren't men who saw me as just a wife and mother. They saw me as a professional, someone with opinions worth hearing. Donovan especially seemed to appreciate my input on things, always asking what I thought about client presentations or office policies. When was the last time Julian had asked for my opinion on anything work-related? He'd come home and tell me about his day, but it was always more like reporting than actually involving me in his world. By the end of the first week, I realized how much I'd been missing. The energy in that office was incredible, and being the center of attention felt amazing. Silas from accounting started bringing me coffee every morning, and Evan from the creative department would always find excuses to stop by my desk to chat. Even Donovan made comments about how the office felt more alive with me there, how I brought something special to their work environment. I started looking forward to getting dressed up each morning, putting on makeup, feeling attractive and appreciated. The contrast with my home life became more and more obvious. I'd come home excited about my day, wanting to share stories about interesting projects or funny conversations, and Julian would listen politely while playing with Leo. But then, like clockwork, he'd excuse himself for his evening smoke break, leaving me to handle dinner cleanup and Leo's bedtime routine. It was like he thought his workday ended when he got home, while mine just shifted into a different phase. 3 weeks into the job, something shifted in how I saw everything. I'd spent the day working on this presentation with Donovan, staying late to get it perfect. And when I finally got home, Julian was already on the balcony with his cigarette. Leo was crying because he was tired and hungry, and I had to immediately switch from feeling professional and valued to being the default parent who handled everything. When Julian came back inside, he asked how my day was, but I could tell he wasn't really listening to my answer. He was already thinking about whatever he wanted to watch on TV or what he needed to do for work tomorrow. That night, after Leo was asleep, Julian sat down next to me on the couch and did something he rarely did anymore. He really looked at me like he was studying my face, and then he took my hands in his. "What's going on?" he asked, and his voice had this concerned tone that caught me off guard. "Where has my wife gone?" The question hit me like a slap. Where had his wife gone? Are you kidding me? I was right here. Same as I'd always been, except now I was also contributing professionally and bringing in my own income. If anything, I was more myself than I'd been in years. "What do you mean?" I asked, and I could hear the edge in my own voice. "You're different," he said, still holding my hands, still staring into my eyes like he was trying to solve some puzzle. "You seem distant, distracted. We barely talk anymore, and when we do, it feels like you're somewhere else." I felt this surge of anger that surprised me. "Maybe I seem different because I'm finally doing something that makes me feel valued," I said, pulling my hands away. "Maybe I'm tired of feeling like my only purpose is to be here waiting for you to finish your cigarette breaks." His face changed, and I could see I'd hit a nerve. "My cigarette breaks? Clara, I work 10-hour days to support this family. Those 20 minutes on the balcony are literally the only time I get to decompress." 20 minutes? I laughed, and it came out harsher than I intended. "Julian, you're out there for over an hour every single night. An hour when I'm handling everything else, when I could use some help or just some adult conversation that isn't about Leo's nap schedule." We stared at each other, and I realized this was the first real argument we'd had in 11 years together. 11 years, and we'd never fought like this. Never had this kind of tension between us. Part of me was almost excited by it, like we were finally addressing things that had been building up under the surface. "I had no idea you felt that way," he said finally, and he sounded genuinely hurt. "Clara, everything I do is for you and Leo. The long hours, the stress, the pressure to keep advancing in my career so we can have the life we want. I thought you understood that. But that was exactly the problem, wasn't it? He thought providing money was the same thing as providing attention, as being present." "I do understand that," I said. "But I need more than just financial security. I need to feel like you're actually interested in me as a person, not just as the mother of your child and the woman who keeps your house running." The conversation went on for another hour, and by the end of it, nothing felt resolved. Julian promised to be more mindful of his evening routine, and I promised to communicate better when I was feeling neglected, but something fundamental had shifted between us. I went to bed that night feeling like we'd crossed some kind of line, and I wasn't sure we could cross back. The next few weeks were awkward in a way our relationship had never been before. Julian did make an effort to cut his smoking break shorter, and he asked more questions about my work, but it felt forced. Meanwhile, the attention I was getting at the office intensified. Donovan started including me in client meetings, saying he valued my perspective. Silas and Evan both found reasons to text me work-related questions in the evenings. The whole environment made me feel alive in a way I'd forgotten was possible. One Friday, Donovan asked if I wanted to grab drinks with the team after work. It was the first time I'd been invited to anything social, and I was excited until I remembered I needed to get home to Leo. When I explained, Donovan looked genuinely disappointed. "You know, Clara," he said, "you're too good to be stuck at home all the time. You should prioritize yourself more." That comment stuck with me all weekend. Here was my boss, someone who barely knew me, recognizing that I deserved more than just domestic responsibilities. Meanwhile, Julian seemed perfectly content with our routine, with me being available whenever he needed me, but never really considering what I might need. On Sunday, we took Leo to the park for a family day out, something we'd done hundreds of times before. But this time felt different. I deliberately left my wedding ring on the bathroom counter that morning, not really knowing why, just feeling like I needed to see what it felt like to go out in the world without that symbol of being claimed. Julian didn't notice at first, and we spent the morning pushing Leo on swings and chasing him around the playground like everything was normal. But during lunch, when I reached for my water bottle, Julian's eyes went straight to my bare ring finger. His face went completely white. "Where's your wedding ring?" he asked, and his voice had this panicked quality I'd never heard before. I looked down at my hand like I was just noticing. "Oh, I must have forgotten to put it back on after my shower," I said. But we both knew that wasn't true. I never forgot my wedding ring. In 12 years, I'd never once left the house without it. "Clara," he said, and now he was using that same concerned tone from our fight a few weeks earlier. "What's really going on here? Talk to me." Something about the way he was looking at me, the desperation in his voice, made me realize this was the moment. This was when I needed to be honest about what I'd been feeling, about what I wanted. "I think I want to leave," I said, and the words came out more calmly than I expected. The silence stretched between us while Leo played with his toy cars, completely oblivious to the fact that his parents' marriage was falling apart right in front of him. Julian's face went through about 5 different expressions before settling on something that looked like devastation. "Leave," he repeated. "Leave what? Leave me?" "I love you," I said. Because that was true. "You're an amazing father, and you're an incredible provider. But I'm not in love with you anymore, Julian. I haven't been for a while." I watched him process this information, and I felt this strange mixture of sadness and relief. Finally, it was out there. Finally, we could stop pretending everything was perfect when I'd been feeling so empty and unfulfilled. "I don't understand," he said, and his voice was barely above a whisper. "What did I do wrong? How do we fix this?" "It's not about fixing anything," I said. "It's about accepting that we've grown into different people, and maybe we're not compatible anymore. Maybe we never really were, and it just took me this long to realize it." Julian spent the rest of that afternoon trying to convince me to reconsider. He suggested marriage counseling, promised to quit smoking, offered to cut back his work hours. He even started crying at one point, which was something I'd seen maybe twice in our entire relationship. But watching him fall apart like that didn't make me want to stay. It just confirmed that I'd already emotionally checked out. "It's too late," I told him as we packed up Leo's toys. "My mind is made up." That evening, after Leo was in bed, we had the conversation about logistics. I explained that I'd need financial support to get my own place, and Julian agreed immediately. He said he'd remortgage the house to give me £15,000, and we could sell the luxury SUV and split the profits. I was honestly surprised by how cooperative he was being, how he seemed willing to give me whatever I asked for. "I just want you to be happy," he said. And he meant it. If this is what you need, then okay. Part of me had expected him to fight harder, to refuse to make it easy for me to leave. But Julian was handling it exactly like he handled everything else, with practical solutions and minimal drama. I moved out 2 weeks later into a nice apartment closer to my office. And for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. The freedom was intoxicating. I could come and go as I pleased, accept those after-work drink invitations, stay up late watching whatever I wanted on TV. I set up a Tinder profile because why shouldn't I? I was single now and I deserved to feel desired, to remember what it was like when someone was excited just to spend time with me. The responses were overwhelming. Dozens of matches, hundreds of messages from men who thought I was beautiful, interesting, worth pursuing. Cole was the first one I actually met in person, and he was everything Julian wasn't. He was spontaneous, flirtatious, completely focused on me when we were together. On our second date, when he told me I was the most captivating woman he'd ever met, I realized how long it had been since anyone had made me feel that special. Evan was different from Cole, but equally attentive. He was more intellectual, always asking about my thoughts on books and movies and current events. When we'd text late into the night, he'd send these long, thoughtful messages about whatever we'd been discussing. It felt like he actually saw me as a complete person, not just as someone's wife and mother. I ended up sleeping with both of them, and I didn't feel guilty about it at all. Why should I? I was prioritizing my own happiness for the first time in years, figuring out what I wanted and needed from a relationship. Leah was adjusting fine to our new arrangement, spending weekdays with me and weekends with Julian. Kids are resilient, and honestly, he was probably better off seeing his mother as a strong, independent woman rather than someone who settled for less than she deserved. The other 3 guys I went out with were nice enough, but nothing serious developed. That was fine with me. I was enjoying the variety, the excitement of never knowing who I might meet or what kind of connection we might have. For the first time in my adult life, I was living entirely for myself, and it felt incredible. 7 weeks into this new chapter, Julian called me. I thought maybe he wanted to adjust our custody schedule or discuss some financial detail, but his tone was different, more formal, distant. "I need some closure," he said. "I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me." Something about the way he said it made my stomach flip. "Okay," I said, settling onto my couch with a glass of wine. "Are you dating?" he asked. I hesitated for a second. Not because I was ashamed, but because I wasn't sure how much detail he really wanted. "Yes," I said finally. "I've been on some dates." "How many?" The question caught me off guard. "Does it matter?" "It matters to me," he said. And there was something cold in his voice I'd never heard before. "How many, Clara?" "5," I said. I'd been on dates with 5 different people. The silence on the other end stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Have you slept with any of them?" he asked finally. I felt this flash of anger. What right did he have to ask me that? We were separated, heading toward divorce. My personal life was none of his business anymore. "Julian, I don't think that's... Have you slept with any of them?" he repeated. And now his voice was completely flat. "2," I said. "I've been intimate with 2 of them." Another long silence. When he spoke again, he sounded like a completely different person. "Okay," he said. "That's what I needed to know." "Wait," I said, because suddenly I was panicking. This conversation wasn't going the way I'd expected. "Why are you asking me this? What does it matter?" "It doesn't matter," he said. "You're right. You're single. You can do whatever you want." But something in his tone suggested it mattered very much. "Julian, are you okay?" "I'm fine," he said. "I'm moving on, just like you are." "Moving on?" I repeated. "What does that mean?" "It means I'm accepting that our marriage is over," he said. "It means I'm starting to date other people too." The words hit me like a physical blow. I'd somehow never considered that Julian would move on, would find someone else. In my mind, he was just supposed to be there waiting in case I ever decided I wanted to come back. "You're dating?" I asked. "I am," he said. "I'm not ready for anything serious yet, but I'm putting myself out there." After we hung up, I sat on my couch feeling completely disoriented. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. Julian was supposed to spend some time being sad, maybe do some self-improvement, and then eventually we'd have a conversation about whether we could work things out. He wasn't supposed to just replace me. But I pushed those feelings aside and focused on my own life. A few months later, I started seeing Reese more seriously. And when he asked if I wanted to make things Facebook official, I said yes. It felt good to post pictures of us together to show the world that I was happy and moving forward. I made sure to use photos where I looked particularly beautiful, where it was obvious that I was thriving. Still, something felt off. I'd scroll through social media and see pictures of Julian at various events, always with different women, always looking confident and happy. He'd lost weight, updated his wardrobe, and seemed to be living his best life. Meanwhile, I was struggling more than I'd expected with the financial reality of being single. My salary was decent, but it was nothing compared to what Julian made. I'd had to downsize my lifestyle significantly, and I missed the security of knowing all the bills were handled. More than that, I missed having daily access to Leo. Our custody arrangement meant I saw him less than I'd anticipated. And when he was with Julian, I felt this constant anxiety about what I might be missing. Julian would send me pictures of them at the zoo or the park or some restaurant, and Leo always looked so happy. Part of me wondered if he was actually better off with his father, which was a thought I tried not to entertain too often. 8 months after our separation, I realized I'd made a mistake. Not the mistake of leaving necessarily, but the mistake of thinking Julian would wait around forever while I figured out what I wanted. He was clearly thriving without me, and that wasn't supposed to happen. We'd been together for 12 years. Didn't that count for something? I started reaching out more frequently, asking about Leo, but also just checking in. "How are you doing?" I'd text, and he'd respond politely but briefly. When I suggested we grab coffee to discuss Leo's upcoming birthday party, he agreed. But when we met up, he was friendly but distant. He treated me like a co-parent, nothing more. "I've been thinking," I said toward the end of our coffee meeting, "about us, about our family. I know I made some mistakes, but maybe we could try counseling now. Maybe we're both in a better place to work on things." Julian looked at me for a long moment, and I could see him choosing his words carefully. "Clara," he said finally, "I offered you counseling when you first said you wanted to leave. You said it was too late, that your mind was made up." "People change their minds," I said. "People make mistakes and learn from them." "You're right," he said. "But some mistakes have permanent consequences." I felt tears starting to form, which surprised me. "So that's it. 12 years together and you're just done." "You were done 8 months ago," he said, not unkindly. "You were done when you took off your wedding ring and told me you weren't in love with me anymore. You were done when you moved out and started dating other people." "I'm just finally catching up." "But we have Leo," I said. "We have a family." "We have a son," he corrected. "And we'll always be connected because of that." "But our family, the way you're thinking of it, ended when you decided to prioritize your happiness over his." That phrase hit me hard because I'd said almost exactly those words to justify my choices. Hearing them repeated back to me made them sound different, selfish in a way I hadn't intended. "I miss you," I said. And it was true. I missed the security, the partnership, the way he'd always made sure everything was taken care of. "I miss us." Julian's expression softened slightly. "I know you do," he said. "But missing someone isn't the same as loving them, and it's definitely not the same as being in love with them. You taught me that." Over the next few months, I tried several more times to convince him that we should give our marriage another chance. I wrote long emails explaining how much I'd grown, how much clearer I was about what I wanted. I suggested we start slowly, maybe just as friends, and see if we could rebuild the connection we'd once had. His responses were always polite but firm. He'd moved on, he said. He was dating someone new, someone who was sure about what she wanted, and he wasn't interested in going backward. When I asked why he couldn't forgive me, why he couldn't give us another chance, he said it wasn't about forgiveness. "It's about trust," he explained. "It's about knowing that when things get difficult, we're both committed to working through them together. You showed me that when you're unhappy, your solution is to leave. I can't build a life with someone knowing that." I wanted to argue that he was being unreasonable, that everyone deserved a second chance, that our history together should count for something. But deep down, I knew he was right. When I'd felt unfulfilled in our marriage, I hadn't tried to fix things. I'd looked for fulfillment elsewhere. And when I'd found it, I'd blown up our entire life without really considering the consequences. Now I was living with those consequences, and they were harder than I'd expected. Reese was a nice guy, but he didn't have Julian's ambition or earning potential. I was working full-time and still struggling financially. I saw Leo less than I wanted. And when I did see him, he'd tell me stories about all the fun things he'd done with Daddy and Daddy's new girlfriend. The life I'd thought I wanted, the freedom and excitement and constant validation, had turned out to be less satisfying than I'd anticipated. What I really wanted was the security and partnership I'd had with Julian, but with more attention and appreciation. I wanted him to fight for me, to prove that I was worth the effort, but instead, he just let me go and built a better life without me. Sometimes I wondered what would have happened if I'd approached our problems differently. If I'd told Julian directly that I needed more attention instead of looking for it elsewhere. If I'd suggested counseling before, I'd already checked out emotionally. If I'd prioritized fixing our marriage instead of prioritizing my own immediate happiness. But those thoughts never lasted long because they required admitting that I'd made the wrong choice, and I wasn't ready to do that. Instead, I focused on the ways Julian had failed me, how he'd never really understood what I needed, how his inability to forgive showed that maybe he'd never loved me as much as I'd thought. The truth was, I'd expected him to spend months or even years trying to win me back, proving that our marriage was worth saving. When he didn't do that, when he just accepted my decision and moved on, it felt like a betrayal. How could 12 years together mean so little to him that he'd just replace me without a fight? What I couldn't understand was why he was being so stubborn about giving us another chance. People made mistakes all the time, and marriages survived much worse things than what I'd done. I'd been honest about my dating. I'd apologized for the way things had ended, and I was willing to work on our issues. What more did he want from me? But Julian seemed to have this rigid standard where once trust was broken, it couldn't be repaired. He talked about needing to be with someone who was completely committed, who wouldn't run when things got difficult. It was like he couldn't see that I'd learned from our separation, that I was ready to be that person now. The worst part was watching him be happy without me. Every mutual friend who mentioned seeing him out with his new girlfriend, every picture Leo drew of their little family unit, every sign that he was thriving in his post-marriage life felt like proof that maybe I hadn't been as important to him as I'd thought. I'd imagined that leaving would make him realize how much he'd taken me for granted, how much he needed to step up as a husband. Instead, it had just made him realize he was better off with someone else, someone who appreciated what he brought to a relationship instead of constantly wanting more. Now, I was stuck in this weird limbo where I couldn't move forward with Reese because I kept comparing him to Julian. But I couldn't go back to Julian because he'd made it clear that ship had sailed. I had the freedom I'd thought I wanted, but it felt hollow compared to the partnership I'd given up. Everyone kept telling me I needed to focus on myself, figure out what I really wanted, build a life that made me happy. But what I wanted was the life I'd already had, just with a few modifications. I wanted Julian's devotion and financial security, but also the excitement and attention I'd found elsewhere. I wanted to be a priority in someone's life, without having to make them a priority in mine. Looking at where I ended up, it was hard not to feel like Julian was being unnecessarily harsh. Sure, I'd made some mistakes, but I'd been going through something, trying to figure out who I was outside of being a wife and mother. Wasn't that normal? Wasn't that something a loving husband should have been more patient with? But Julian had always been black and white about everything, and apparently that extended to marriage, too. There was no gray area for him. No room for human mistakes or personal growth. Once I'd shown him that I could be unhappy enough to leave, he'd written me off completely. So, here I was 8 months later, still trying to understand how 12 years together could end so definitively, still wondering why he couldn't see that what we'd had was worth fighting for, worth rebuilding. Still hoping that eventually he'd realize he missed me, too, and we could find a way back to each other. But as more time passed, as he seemed more and more settled in his new life, I was starting to accept that maybe this really was permanent. Maybe some mistakes really couldn't be undone, and maybe the life I'd walked away from was gone forever.